I'm Shagato Datta. I'm a managing director at Ideas42. We're a behavioral science research firm that works with partners in different areas, ranging from governments to nonprofits all across the world. And the focus of our work is using behavioral science to design solutions to pressing social problems in a variety of different domains.
I'm Josh Martin. I work closely with Shagato and with Laura on our international governance work, trying to help governance better serve their citizens' needs by helping them design their systems and their working practices in line with the research on human behavior. In the UK, for instance, I think they made some foundational errors in going and asking for behavioral solutions before they even knew what bigger picture systems had to be put in place to mitigate the crisis. And it's clear in this crisis that the only thing that really works is restrictions on economic activity. And so once those have been put in, I think there's been a lot of really useful contributions from behavioral scientists across the board. But those there's really no substitute for those restrictions at a basic level. So I think we have to recognize as behavioralists when our time is right to come in and contribute to the design of systems once the right ones are already established. This is a crisis that has a lot to do with the way in which services are delivered, and they're having to be delivered now in different ways than ever before because of the restrictions on movement and gathering. And so a lot of our partners we're finding need a lot of help on thinking through exactly how some of the public health guidelines are to be put into practice at the point of service delivery. I mean, how do you say many governments are now handing out money in new ways and to new people, and many of those ways depend on people coming together in a physical location to receive their funds. And so how to design that moment in a way that's safe from a health standpoint, but also effective from an economic standpoint.
So to pick up on Josh's point, I think what is sort of where behavioral science is not useful, perhaps, is thinking about what should these broad changes be. So, I mean, one way I often like to think about it is what behavioral science is good for is once you know what it is that people need to be doing, then it's useful to use these tools to figure out what is an easier or a more effective way to actually get those things to happen. But I don't think that it's behavioral science's sort of place in some sense to be saying, should we be restricting movement in this particular way, or should we be letting X or Y kind of business open? But where you can contribute is figuring out, once you've got the rough parameters of that, how do you actually make that happen? We try to sort of make the point that you can't design policy without taking how people are going to respond to it and how they're going to behave in response to it into account. And so there's no point sort of saying this is what we want to happen when we sort of know that people are not going to subvert that in some way, going to do something else. And so you've got to make the policy sort of match human behavioral tendencies. And if anything, what's been frustrating for me watching some of the responses play out, especially I think at the sort of policy government level, is that it feels like we've been trying to, as a field, get this message across, but it hasn't got across enough, because you're seeing many things done which don't take human response into account, and which are done in ways, and then governments seem to be somewhat surprised that people might want to find ways to continue to, for instance, make ends meet when their source of livelihood has been cut off. This should not come as a surprise to anyone. And you can actually design your response in a way that takes that into account, but I think not enough of that has happened.
Does this crisis change our mental models of what is right or what is possible? In the United States, it seems like there's a consensus that anyone who gets COVID should have access to treatment, to healthcare treatment, which is not the way that we usually think about healthcare provision in this country. So I'm curious if you think that this is a time when our ethical norms and our imaginative capacity is changing.
To the extent that there were people who were very skeptical of the ideas of things like some kind of way of getting money to a lot of people in a quick time frame, that skepticism feels like it's certainly more muted now than it was before this, right?
I'm sort of torn on this point because, particularly when we talk about governance, like at the beginning, everyone was saying, look at the authoritarians, they're the ones who are winning. And then now it's clear that, in fact, the populists are the ones who are losing because they let politics get in the way of what the science is saying and what the institutions underneath them are trying to get them to do. And so on some level, politically, when it comes to governance, that's a sort of odd combination. I mean, a lot of populists are authoritarian, and so I think we're still trying to make sense of like what electorates are learning, I suppose, about the type of politicians and the type of governments and governmental systems that are going to be most effective in responding to a crisis like this. I don't think in some ways, I hope it's not a moment of big shifting in that direction, because I think it's easy for people to get the wrong ideas about what has worked and what hasn't worked, and I think it could lead to a dangerous place. So on the other hand, I think if there is a consistent thread to be drawn there, I think strong institutions have broadly held the day. Also, in a very behavioral sense, good communication coming from strong institutions. So trustworthy communication about science in a packaged way. What springs to mind is the way that New Zealand and other countries have described a scale with clear criteria for each level of the scale, along with clear interventions that go along with each level of the scale that can guide a reopening process. And when it's clear to everybody what it means when you go from level 1 to level 2 and level 2 to level 3, and I think that's an effective form of simple, clear communication that I wish other governments had adopted. You can only, of course, have that type of communication if you have institutions that can implement it in sequences and increments like they can. So, I think, I hope that it's a moment for people to reimagine the role of government in building those types of systems, and hopefully the demand is continued to be built for more and better of those in the future.
So last question, I'm going to ask you to do the impossible and forecast the future. In 2030, when we're accounting for the Sustainable Development Goals and looking back over the past 15 years, how do you think the world's going to remember 2020 and the COVID pandemic?
The hope is that we might look back and say, oh, that was something of a turning point, and we didn't quite go back to business as usual when this ended. Because I think also the recognition in many ways that what this is exposing is enormous gaps in what systems and governments and institutions are actually able to do. And the bad outcome would be we found these gaps, and then the crisis passed and we just forgot about them. But hopefully that's not where we'll be. We'll say at least some of these gaps are things that people recognize would be important to address, if for no other reason that there's going to be some other crisis.
Pontificating here, maybe that's in some ways part of the role for our field or our discipline, is to try to extend the moment of learning or the eureka of having come to these revelations into the future, beyond the point when they're staring us in the face, because we have a tendency to bury the past. So if there's in some way maybe we can design some sort of mechanism for that to happen, I think that will serve us well 10 years from now.